really delighted to have the opportunity to talk with each other and with you. So the way we've arranged it, I'm going to kick this off, and I'm going to pose a few questions to Tom, and then we will reverse seats. So Tom, let's start with the easy issue. Let's talk about Amazon. And I know you've thought a lot about whether the Amazon campaign and the unfortunate loss of the election by the union is a teachable moment. And I'd like you to talk about your thoughts about that. But by way of introduction, I have to say that maybe I was naive, but I was quite shocked by the outcome. Not so much that the union won, but that the vote count was so wide, and that so few people actually cast a vote. And the reason I thought maybe this would be different, even though I guess a lot of people predicted, oh, this is Amazon, this is in the South, it's a huge uphill battle. But the reason I thought maybe this time the results would be different was that this election occurred in the middle of the pandemic, with the interlocking health and economic, racial justice and democracy crises, with all the attention that was brought over the last year to essential workers and the pressures that they were working under, with all the attention brought to Amazon and its exploding business during the last year. The fact that it was in the South, but in Bessemer, Alabama, which has a long union history. Um, the fact that the workforce was largely African American and largely women, I thought uh, could have a different outcome. And even I might throw in the strange bedfellows that seem to be supporting this campaign, from Bernie Sanders to Marco Rubio. So it was a surprise to me, perhaps mistakenly. But tell us your thoughts, Tom. Is this a teachable moment?
Well, thank you, Wilma, and thanks to our LERA colleagues in the Boston chapter and elsewhere for joining us and organizing this tonight. I think it was and still is a teachable moment. I share with you the surprise by the margin of that vote. I think, like most people, it was hard to predict whether they would win or lose, but the fact that it was by such a large margin does really require us to think hard about what are the teachable lessons. Uh, I would offer a couple of points about this case and about what it means to us as professionals in this field at the moment. The first is that the biggest takeaway is that this case illustrates that it essentially is almost impossible for workers to realize the intent of the law, as the president articulated in his famous statement, that workers should make a decision about whether to organize or not, rather than managers or their consultants or their lawyers. The reality is that even before Bessemer, the evidence from our own research, our PhD student a number of years ago, is that 9 out of 10 times that a union gets certification for an election, it still never gets to a first contract if management opposes. And in this case, you had such a strong managerial opposition and such a well-resourced employer that they could do all kinds of things that really discouraged organization and the election. Everything from the traditional captive audience speeches and so on, maybe even getting rid of a few workers for reasons that the board might find are for union animus, by putting posters inside the bathroom stalls is an insult on human dignity. So this employer went farther than many others, but the reality is that that's where the power lies. Now, the other thing that went on here that we don't quite know the numbers on, and you and I have discussed, is that Amazon hired a lot of people from the time when the initial organizing drive started, or the initial request for an election to the time of the vote. And they offered a bonus to people to leave. So what that churning of the workforce had, how big of an impact it had. It certainly had an impact, but how big of an impact, we don't quite know. So I think that's the teachable lesson, is that it's almost impossible to organize a well-resourced employer that opposes union organizing under the current process. The second thing is, what does it mean for Amazon? Well, it means that they can get away with this, but I think there's a larger lesson for Amazon too. They won this battle, but it's only going to be won in a series of efforts to try to gain some form of voice. And so if they think it's over, they're mistaken. And we see various kinds of worker actions outside of the NLRB process and bargaining unit structures. We see efforts to gain more voice at the corporate level. Even if the union won in Bessemer, it would have faced this tremendous uphill battle to have an impact on Amazon's working practices, because they're set at the corporate level. And so there's going to be ongoing efforts to try to address this. But I think there's also a teachable moment here for the labor movement. And that is, their current organizing model simply does not work. To get 50 plus 1% of, or 50% plus one vote, to get one new union member is just not a viable process and a viable proposition for rebuilding the labor movement and giving workers the kind of voice that they're calling for today. And so the labor movement has to do some very serious soul searching about other methods for increasing membership and building membership, perhaps incrementally, up to the point where they can get collective bargaining status, or finding different ways to influence corporations outside of the formal collective bargaining process. So I think there's a lot of lessons here. I'm not sure they're being taken to heart by the labor movement or by policymakers in Washington at the moment. And I'm not sure that Amazon is taking them to heart, because they have said, Jeff Bezos famously said, we got to do more for our employees, but it doesn't mean that they're going to become neutral or roll over the next time there's an organizing drive. It means that they're going to double down in doing whatever they can to try to reduce incentives for organizing. So those are some of the teachable lessons. I think there are others, but that's sort of my take on what we experienced here.
So let me go sort of to a question that flows from that. Some people have said that one of the teachable moments or teachable lessons from the Amazon campaign is the need for labor law reform. Some people have said, well, if we had labor law reform, particularly in the form of the PRO Act, which is pending in Congress, this election never should have been lost. So let me ask you your thoughts about that question, but could you also put it in the context of not only the pending labor law reform bill, which is a very comprehensive bill, but also the task force that President Biden recently announced on labor. And for those people here who are maybe too young to remember, Tom, of course, sat on the Dunlop Commission during the Clinton administration. That's about the time I first had the pleasure of meeting Tom. I was at the Federal Mediation Conciliation Service, and you served on the Dunlop Commission. So what is your experience tell us, or tell you, about this moment?
Well, it's very clear that the organizing provisions of the NLRA, and as administered by the board as best they can, really need to be fixed. That's a necessary condition for labor law reform, and there are the standard kinds of things in the PRO Act that have been proposed before, stronger penalties and so on, modifying the election process in various ways, much more effective mediation and perhaps even arbitration of first contracts to try to remedy some of those aspects of the law that we know and we knew in the Dunlop Commission, and we concluded in the Dunlop Commission with very clear language that the law was not delivering on its promises, it was broken, and those aspects needed to be fixed. That's a long-standing recognition and a necessary condition for labor policy, labor law reform. But now I'm going to go beyond it, because I don't believe that just what's in the PRO Act with respect to the organizing process will, even if somehow magically it could be passed, and I think we all have our doubts about that, and recognize the uphill battle for that, for realizing. Even if that were passed, then I think we'd see some modest growth in union representation, but we wouldn't see the rebuilding of worker voice, the rebuilding of the kind of bargaining power that workers are asking for, or the forms of representation that our surveys and that by their direct actions out there are calling for. And so I would describe the situation in terms of labor policy is we need that aspect of the PRO Act. There are many other features of the PRO Act that go beyond the organizing process with respect to independent contractors, with respect to arbitration of non-union employees, with respect to non-compete clauses, the Taft-Hartley right to work provisions, and so on. Those are going to be even harder to incorporate into any kind of successful legal campaign. But we need to open up the law in much more fundamental ways if we're going to respond to what workers want today. And that means we've got to provide them with mechanisms for individual representation that are stronger and protect them if they can't get exclusive bargaining rights, perhaps board representation, perhaps works councils that provide more viable ways of getting employee input on the whole range of issues they're concerned around, whether it's technology or sexual harassment or the nature of the products and services and how they are being delivered, that we're hearing workers protest around the country. This is what both our surveys that we've done show workers want today, and they want collective bargaining. So why don't we have a robust debate and a public debate about how we respond to what workers want and embed it in a fundamentally updated labor law. Now, the Biden administration, to its credit, it's clearly saying we know that we need to rebuild worker bargaining power. We know that to get the good jobs and the high quality jobs and the Build Back Better vision that they have for America, that requires rebuilding the labor movement. But they don't have a vision laid out that will get us this broader form of representation that might actually foster an interesting debate in Congress, because there are some people who I think are ready for that debate. I think there are efforts to strengthen the purchasing in the role of some credits or some requirements in the government contracting of services is a positive step. I think the efforts to say we're going to be a model employer at the federal level and reverse some of the Trump executive orders that they've already done and take the next step, perhaps to go back, Wilma, to the days that we met and talked about the partnership at the federal level that FMCS helped to facilitate. Those are all very positive steps. And I think we could see even more in terms of co-enforcement of wage and hours, safety and health, where there could be some developments. But as we all know, those executive actions can be reversed by the next administration. So I think we have an uphill battle to bring the public into this process so that their voice, they see the unfairness in the current system. They see the need to respond to what workers are saying they want, and they're ready to put some pressure on their elected representatives and on business and labor to be involved. The fundamental problem with the Dunlop Commission, one that I argued with before it got started and after it got started, was it was just a backdoor, back room kind of process. Almost no one outside of those of us directly involved in this field knew it even existed. And our mutual good friend, Lynn Reinhardt, corrected me when I gave a presentation once. It was at the Economic Policy Institute, and she was there, and I said, you know, one of the problems with the Dunlop process was 99.5% of the American public didn't even know it exists. And she raised her hand. She said, "You're absolutely wrong." She said it was 99.9%. And so, you know, that's the problem.
So I'm curious, Tom, whether you would agree with something that I often say, and it really relates to the point you just made that the public has to be behind this. So my question is, how do you get the public behind it? And my view is that you only get labor law reform when there is a stronger labor movement, or at least a stronger worker movement. And I know a lot of people look to labor law reform as creating a stronger labor movement, but to me, it goes the other way around. And so I'm curious what you think about that. And my second question is, do you have any sense where the employer community is? And I know there's no single employer community, but in terms of the employer community with any influence, do you sense any openness on their part to talking about some measure of labor law reform?
I completely agree with you that labor policy change, labor law change is only going to be successful if the public is engaged and if the labor movement, broadly defined, workers are actively out there protesting, raising all kinds of havoc, demonstrating that there's a real need and that they're not going to give up, and that therefore something is needed to get this under control. That's what we saw in the 1930s. That's what we saw in the public sector in the 1960s. That's, I think, what even in reverse, Taft-Hartley, the business community, and others were much more active in making the case that these strikes are out of control and we got to rein labor in. So it's only in those moments where there is enough activity out there demonstrating that this is an important issue. The public is going to need to weigh in, and government needs to respond. So I think that's absolutely right. Now, there are, I think there are other ways to engage the business community on this. We can't wait for that uprising. Some parts of the business community are so ideologically opposed, and I would put that as the majority of the business community, that we're not going to move them. They're the bottom feeders. They're the lowest common denominator in the in the business community. And unfortunately, the trade associations, from the National Association of Manufacturers, the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, the restaurant employers, the retail, small business, those associations cater to those lowest common denominators. Within the business community, there are people who recognize this system is broken and it's out of balance and something needs to be done. But they're not willing to stand up to their other business counterparts and say, all right, gang, we've got to get on with this, and we've got to have a dialogue, and we've got to update our law in sensible ways, in fair ways. And that means, you know, we aren't going to have this unlimited power going forward, but they aren't willing to raise their voices. You and I can have conversations with those individuals, and there are some out there on a one-on-one basis. I'm having a session actually with a bunch of business leaders in Europe over the need for a new social contract, and there are companies in other parts of the world who recognize they need to get on with these issues more effectively. There are a few like that in the United States as well, but they're just all afraid to take on the dominant view.
So that said, Tom, is this a transformational moment coming out of the last year with all these intersecting crises? A lot of people say, well, there's no way we can go back to the way things were. Other people say, well, don't expect it to be a transformational moment because existing biases will just settle in. And I take this moment just to do a little advertising for the LERA annual meeting, which is in a couple of weeks. And the theme, which is this a transformational moment? I think the jury's out. You know, during the economic crisis of 2008, people said, oh, this is going to be the moment for a New Deal. And what did we get? Instead, we got the Tea Party. So I really don't know, but what's your thought? Is all the worker activism of the last 5, 7, 8 years, is it sufficient? And particularly given all the crises of the last year, is it sufficient to make this time different?
I don't think it's sufficient. I think it's a starting point. It's a base. And it could be a tinderbox that explodes as people are told to come back to work. And if that's not handled well, there will be many people who will find themselves frustrated and unable to meet their family and health and other considerations, and at the same time go back to work. I think there are some transformational opportunities. For example, the state of New York just passed something they call the HEROES Act, but basically it requires safety and health committees in facilities, something that one could possibly, and I think you've written on this, Wilma, consider at the federal level. There might be a way to write that into our OSHA to require safety and health committees. Mechanisms like that that give people a taste for what's needed and what's possible might help to spur more activity that then gets frustrated and elevates up to more of a crisis. So I think it's a possible starting point, but it's not there yet. It's going to have to be elevated. But I think it's time for me to ask you a question, since I've said now everything that I know and probably things I don't even know. I just said, but I'd like to, let's turn to the institution you know so well, the NLRB. What can we expect from the NLRB in the near term? I mean, there are appointments. There's a lot of work to be done, but let me ask you what you expect in that domain.
Well, let me start with two general observations. One, a note of optimism, and one, a note of caution. So in terms of optimism, I think that one of the positive things about this moment is that, at least for the moment, the war on government within government seems to have died down. So we will no longer be populating agencies with appointees who are hostile to the mission of the agency. And I would say that the day one action by President Biden to remove the general counsel of the NLRB was one such move. So even though there is not yet a Democratic majority on the board itself, there is an acting general counsel, one of the regional directors, who is just the opposite of hostile to the mission of the agency. He's deeply committed to it, and he's already making a big difference. At the moment, the chair of the NLRB is the one sitting Democrat. That again was a day one appointment by President Biden. She serves with 3 Republicans for the time being. There's 1 Democratic vacancy, which could be filled at any time once there's a nomination. But there won't be an opportunity for a majority on the board until late August, when another term of a Republican member expires. So hopefully by late summer, early fall, there will be a new Democratic majority. So that that is the word of optimism that I think we can expect a worker-centered um, NLRB going forward. We won't have people there who are hostile to the mission of the agency. The one word of caution that I would offer, and I say this as a veteran of presidential appointments. I went from uh, President Clinton to President Bush twice, and then President Obama, is that it is important to be realistic about what the NLRB on its own can do. There are really limits to what can be accomplished under this aging New Deal statute. The antagonists call it a New Deal relic. I just call it aging. Um, you have decades of precedent that the board has to navigate. There are tensions that this law has with existing social, economic, and workplace realities. The last time the law was significantly amended was 1947, and that was all anti-union amendments. Any efforts to amend the law since 1947 have all ended up in gridlock. So as one of my favorite labor law professors, Jim Brudney, wrote, that we haven't had a change in labor law since the interstate highway was built, television entered American homes, and Jackie Robinson integrated Major League Baseball. So that's a pretty graphic way of telling you the labor law that we are living with. This is a law that was controversial from the start. There are deeply held and very divided views about this law. It has never been fully accepted as legitimate. And as Lindsey Graham said in about 2010, with respect to the NLRB, inoperable is progress. So that's the view of some people on the Republican side. So this is a statute that some say is at war with itself because of the internal tensions created by the Wagner Act and the Taft-Hartley amendments. So certainly things can be done by a board that is committed to a dynamic interpretation of this law, but you have to be realistic. It cannot effectuate radical change. It can make modest, although meaningful changes. Obviously, for major change and a major overhaul and updating of the law, we need labor law reform. So that's by way of introduction. What the new uh, Democratic majority, when it happens, along with the Democratic General Counsel, what they face really is not the usual pendulum swing that the board is famous for, the flip-flopping. This is not a simple matter of autocorrect, and that is because of the very substantial and deep reversal of precedent that went on during the Trump administration. It went far beyond just reversing uh, Obama era precedent. They like to say we're just undoing or correcting what the Obama board did, but that's not true. They went far beyond, going decades into precedent and overruling a precedent that sometimes people never even asked for a reversal of precedent. They just reached out on their own to do so. So it will take a lot for a new majority on the board just to deal with the damage, in my view, the damage that was done during the last administration. And that could take a long time, let alone going beyond where things existed at the end of the Obama administration. Besides engaging in a lot of adjudication that reversed precedent, they also did a number of rulemakings, which is unusual for the NLRB. And those will obviously be subject to reconsideration, either through replacement or rescission of some sort. So, and by the way, there's still some time left for them to do damage because they still have a majority until at least the end of August. Well, beyond the end of August, they won't have a majority anymore. So I might mention a few Trump era decisions that I think are ripe for reversal. I think you mentioned this, but the cases that deal with the coverage of the law, so who's an employee, who's an employer, they've taken a rather narrow view of who's an employee. They've taken a rather narrow view of joint employer. The joint employer issue, of course, became widely read about with respect to the McDonald's case and the allegations that McDonald's, the corporation, was a joint employer with its franchisees. Um, the board made it much more difficult for unions to organize in terms of the scope of appropriate bargaining units. For example, holding that smaller units within a big a factory such as Volkswagen or Boeing had to be organized on a plant-wide basis. That for example, a smaller unit of skilled tradesmen at Volkswagen was not an appropriate unit. Again, reversing decades of precedent on that. The right of access of employees to property was at issue, particularly take a big casino, which has a lot of contractor employees. So the direct employees of the casino would be entitled to engage in some kind of union activity on the premises, on off duty, of course, and not on their actual work site. But what about the employees of the contractors who work at the casino? So there again, the Trump board reversed earlier precedent. The nature of protected speech and how you lose the protection of the act. For example, using bad words. The Trump board issued a decision involving General Motors that brought together 3 different scenarios, including what strike replacements say, and finding that strikers lose the protection of the act when they use bad words directed at strike replacements. And also the scope of protected concerted activity. So the law protects not just union activity, but other activity where people get together concertedly to try to improve their wages in terms of conditions. And the Trump board pretty drastically reduced the notion of concerted and the notion of activity for mutual aid and protection. So I think these issues are certainly ripe for reversal. One issue that they decided not to touch, however, and that's the organizing rights and employee status of graduate teaching assistants. So they left that intact, one victory. So, and then I think there are a whole series of issues that could arise if you'd like me to go into those.
Well, I would love to. I'd like to get your view on one other issue, and that is this, and this may be where you're going, around independent contractors and what the Biden administration might be able to do, what the board might or might not be able to do on that issue, because that's such a lively debate. But I want to also alert people that I think it's after that, it's time to hear questions and so on. And so I would urge you, this is a warning or an opportunity, use the raise hand function if you know how to do that, the little blue hand, you just punch on that and we'll call on you. But Wilma, maybe while they're thinking about their tough questions or debating points with us, you could maybe comment on what you see as possibilities for action on independent contractors.
Yeah, so the independent contractor exclusion from the labor law, from the exclusion of employee status, has been a thorny issue for decades and decades, going back to the mid-1940s with the Supreme Court's decision, and then the Taft-Hartley Amendment explicitly excluding independent contractors. And this is just an issue that arises all the time. And people have been debating whether this is the proper way to look at the protections of labor and employment law, whether this is the proper gateway. But certainly nothing has brought this issue as much into the public eye as the Uber phenomenon and these new business models enabled by technology. And so, as everybody knows, Uber treats their drivers as independent contractors, as do all of these platforms for the most part, treating their workers as independent contractors. This has led to a slew of litigation all over the country under various employment laws, both federal and state level. During the Trump administration, the NLRB General Counsel issued an advisory memorandum finding that Uber drivers were independent contractors not entitled to the protection of the law. And the Labor Department at the very end of the Trump administration issued a rule which really narrowed the employee status for the purpose of the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Biden Labor Department has already withdrawn that independent contractor rule. And I think it can be expected fairly that the NLRB and the Department of Labor going forward will return to broader definitions of employee status that exist under the respective laws. The Fair Labor Standards Act has a much broader definition of employee than the NLRA does. The NLRA turns on a common law definition, but even within that, the Trump administration shrunk the definition. So I think we can see a broader application. Meanwhile, the Uber drivers and some of the unions that work with them around the country have been experimenting. So there was an experiment in Seattle in 2016. The city of Seattle enacted an ordinance which basically gave Uber drivers and other taxi drivers treated as independent contractors the right to collectively bargain as independent contractors. The law was immediately challenged by the Chamber of Commerce on both labor law preemption and antitrust law grounds. The Ninth Circuit threw out the labor law preemption argument, but did uphold the antitrust law challenge, rejecting the city of Seattle's reliance on what's called the state action exemption. At that point, the Teamsters and the city of Seattle, the case had been pending for a long time. They got kind of tired of waiting, so they decided to pursue a regulatory approach, and they have passed a minimum wage law and some other regulatory protections. But they also came to conclude that it would be very difficult to organize Uber drivers under an NLRA firm level appropriate unit majority status basis. So I would say that even if the NLRB does change its view and does accept the notion that Uber drivers are employees, there still may be this question of whether they can be organized, which has led other unions around the country and other worker groups to start experimenting with the notion of sectoral bargaining. The state of Connecticut recently introduced a bill that would provide for sectoral bargaining for these kind of drivers. It was criticized from all sides, the platforms and the AFL-CIO and other worker groups. And so they withdrew the legislation for the moment to study the issue. Earlier this week, it was reported that New York is close to a deal being worked out between the Independent Drivers Guild, maybe some other unions, and some platforms and legislators that would also provide a mechanism for sectoral bargaining. This has its critics. This is a whole question which has deeply divided the labor movement, whether it's appropriate to make a deal or a compromise on collective bargaining that would somehow allow the platforms to maintain independent contractor status, or whether it's important to insist that full employee status be afforded to these drivers. With that would go collective bargaining rights, assuming that they were organizable under the NLRA model. So I think this is an issue to watch. There's been a lot of dynamism of thinking, I believe. So happens I'm writing or co-authoring a law review article on this subject. But I think it is a really interesting issue to watch. In terms of other issues that might arise, I just want to harken back to your mention of the New York State HEROES Act, calling for creation of a joint labor management, safety, and health committees. This is something that's been talked about for a while. I think about 15 states have had these laws on the books for some time. It is a way to give employees a sense of what having a voice at work is. While they have never been challenged in the past on labor law preemption grounds, I could envision a potential challenge arising, although I think it can be successfully won. I think there are good arguments to be made that they shouldn't be preempted. But there are other kind of, in the absence of federal legislation and the gridlock on labor law reform, some states have been very active. And so I think we're going to continue to see those kinds of protections arising at the state level with potential challenges coming up.
Well, thank you. That's a really important rundown on that particular set of developments. We have several comments, questions in the chat. Let me ask or address them as best we can. Candace asked, were there any connections between the faith and belief communities in the organizing campaign at Bessemer. And, you know, there's controversy about that too. Yes, there were efforts. Was there enough? Who knows? Different people will have different points of view, and some have written that there wasn't enough of that. Then there's the response from some of the faith communities themselves saying that we were very supportive. But uh, clearly, the point that Candace is making and in her question is that today, in order to win an election or it's got to be a public issue, and it's got to reach out to the social networks, the religious networks or the identity groups that people are part of. And that has to be part of a modern organizing campaign. It has to be done effectively, and it has to be done in reality with respect, not looking just for their vote and their support at the ballot time, but to bring them into the process. So I think that's a really important question. Don O'Brien asks, who speaks for the other side or for the other than traditional union workers? If there is to be some new models of employer representation, who's going to advocate for them in Congress? Well, I don't know if you have a good answer to that. I don't.
I don't either, really.
It would be-
You know, I think if we got to that point and it was seriously being considered, that it is possible that some of the labor movement would actually support that. I just think that at the moment, the labor movement is really focused on what's in the PRO Act, as extensive as it is, but certainly on the improvements to the organizing and collective bargaining process, that the kind of things and the remedies that Tom talked about, and the definition of employee, which is in the PRO Act, which does adopt the broadest definition we know, the so-called ABC test that was passed into law in California. So I don't think it's impossible that the traditional labor movement would advocate for this if we got to that point, but we're not there.
Yeah, and it would be interesting to say that perhaps the administration itself would become the advocate, but that would mean they'd have to bring the labor movement along. And that's, I think, where the administration ought to go, but I don't think in reality at the moment they're going to go there, but maybe someday they will. Arnold asks in his typical ways, he's not using inappropriate language that would get him, outside of the protection of the National Labor Relations Act. But he's saying, are we condemned to retain this majoritarianism that raises benefits for employers from opposition to recognition and to reaching agreements? And that's another way of saying, I think, there are these other models of representation, whether they're works councils or minority unions or other kinds of things. And I don't know if we can get that point that that's what workers want a voice. Workers want to have participatory processes. They also want collective bargaining. And so we have to recognize that that's where the American workforce is, but that's not where our institutions are. But you may have a view on whether the board can do anything in this non-majority situation.
Yeah, well, there's been the argument that circulated for years and years that the board has the authority to require employers to bargain with minority unions. That employers did bargain with minority unions before the act was passed, and that they have the authority. So far, neither the board nor the board's general counsels have taken up this argument, although it's been raised a number of times, including most recently during the Obama administration. I think the argument is a difficult one to make once the NLRA, once the Wagner Act was passed, although it's not an impossible argument. I guess the question that I've raised, and I don't know the answer to it, is let's say you have a lot of minority recognized unions around the country, for a few people in a workplace. Is that really going to build a stronger labor movement? And maybe it will, maybe it's the foot in the door. But so far, the argument hasn't really taken hold. And I think it would almost, to me, it would almost require that if an employer was faced with a demand for recognition from a minority of employees, that it would have to extend any agreement reached with them to all members of the workplace or of the employer, which I guess is the rule in some European countries. So this majority rule is rather unique to the US system. But that wouldn't be the law at the moment without some legislative change. Yes, and as Bob McCursey's just written, Charlie Morris has written about this extensively over the years. He's brought cases to the board, including a request that the board do rulemaking. And so far, even Democratic majority boards and general councils have declined to take on that battle.
Well, and but he persists. To Charlie's credit, he stays with it, and more power to him.
And there are other people who have written about this. Claude Summers and others have written about this over the years, that it really is within the power of the board to, it's certainly lawful to recognize a minority union. The question is whether there's any obligation on the part of the employer to recognize a minority union.
Yeah. Rick Riley takes us in a new direction. I think it's a fresh suggestion, and that is, he's not saying that, but most of our conversation has been on the federal and the national level and so on of law. But what about the local level? There's so much activity now, concern around police unions. There's a lot of activity around essential workers and how one provides more protections. Do we see a new vibrancy at the local level? Is there a room for us as professionals to become more active in facilitating different forums and different ways of interacting? What do we see at our local levels? And I'd welcome anyone's comment on this, because we all come from slightly different communities. And some of you have been making efforts. I know you mentioned Bob McCursey. Bob has tried to bring police and other groups into conversations around the critical issues affecting public safety and unions. Is there room for action at that level? What do people think here? Not just Wilma and I.
While people are thinking, I might just make a comment that at the moment, while we've had gridlock at the federal level for so long, and while we still basically have a divided Congress, I would say all innovation and dynamic thinking and real activity is going on at the local level. The specific issue that you raised, though, is much more difficult in terms of the police. And I certainly would be curious to hear from the arbitrators in the group, who, especially if you've ever arbitrated any police cases, what you're seeing and what you think.
We certainly have a good sample of arbitrators. So what do you think? And you've got a good sample of people who have had police.
Oh, I see. Arnie's raised his hand.
Okay, Arnie.
You have to unmute, though.
Yeah, you have to unmute, remember. Arnie, you're still muted.
Yeah, there you are.
I want to raise my hand on the issue of Amazon. I can talk about the police in a minute, but it ties to my question on majoritarianism. Employers have become, in my decades of doing this stuff, employers have become so much more oppositional, and it is to the point now that employers just benefit from not getting recognition, taking all kinds of legal action, And then having a first contract, and I'm sorry, and then when they get to negotiations, not negotiating so they can get rid of the burden and be union free until the next certification round comes. And there's a real reward to employers for not negotiating. And I think the Amazon is maybe part of that, but more importantly, I think that people were voting in Amazon, if there was ever an election that had public interest, that had public support, and had the presidential endorsement, it was at Amazon. And look at the results. And the results, I think, first of all, Amazon was paying pretty good money, so that's sort of off the table. So it was not a traditional labor management money issue. It was worker rights, more importantly. But management had such power that it was the threat of management, just the whim of management deciding they were going to shut down that plant, that it intimidated workers, putting a mailbox on the property, changing the traffic lights and so on, and denying access to it. It made it, the employees must have been absolutely petrified. If you remember back to the days when Walmart shut down their butcher components in all of the Walmarts across the country because a butcher shop in some southern state organized, and they said, we're not going to have any more butcher shops, we're going to have takeout meat. And the Walmart in Quebec, they shut down when it got unionized. I mean, that's the power of big corporations that have access, that have contact with these grassroots people we're talking about. So they're very fearful of it. And I think the intimidation was just so overwhelming that even with government endorsement, it couldn't pull it off.
Yeah, but Arnie, let's turn to the police. In our town of Boston, big controversies on all sorts of police issues, and then the mayor says, the acting mayor, and she may not be the mayor when the contract begins to be negotiated, we're going to take these issues into real collective bargaining. Now, you've mediated one or two disputes over the course of your career. If you're a mediator, what can you do given the public concerns, given the fact that it still is a collective bargaining process between the city and the police? Do you see room for those of us who want to be constructive professionals but neutrals in this domain to really help bring about some of the reforms? And
it's probably more likely through mediation than it is through legislation or litigation or arbitration. But it's still an awfully heavy lift. The public is not pro-worker. The public is not, certainly the Republicans are not pro-capital police, but the whole atmosphere is anti-collective bargaining, anti-union, and anti-union representatives. That is so pervasive. You try, better opportunities perhaps on the local level, but the public sentiment is woeful. It's just woeful.
Yeah, no, and I think that's right. But Wilma, we're going to give you the last word. You are our president, and we're president-elect.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to do this with you, Tom. Tom has been my teacher about labor relations ever since I met him. I've learned more from him than I can ever tell you. But I guess my final thought is, and sort of responding to what Arnie said, is that I think the public sentiment about police unions is probably not real high, but surveys would show that the public sentiment about unions in general has certainly improved significantly, and it's well over 50%, over 60%, I think now, approval. But one of the things I wonder about, and this goes back to the teachable moment with Amazon, is that while there's nothing like winning, there are still significance to the whole campaign, even though it was a loss.
True.
And one of the things I wonder about is whether the public really got this disparity of power between this huge corporation, not to mention its wealthiest man in the world, CEO, and its employees. True, they were making $15 an hour. They weren't making $7.50, but nonetheless, African-American workforce, essential workers during this last year. And by the way, this was, as I understand it, an organic campaign. This was not top down. These workers came, it was a brand new facility, just opened a little over a year ago. So whether the David and Goliath aspect to this campaign was observed by the public, I don't know if the public would be as aware of it, but, and this goes to your point, Arnie, about workers being intimidated by all the different kinds of things that Amazon did. Amazon is relentless in their desire to remain non-union. But this is a company which over the last year there have been stories about the different kinds of sophisticated surveillance and monitoring technology that it's employed. So not only did these people in the warehouse have all kind of devices connected to them, which record every single move that they make and how fast they make it and all that kind of thing, but it's been written up that Amazon is employing this technology to basically survey and keep track of the environment, not only labor conduct, but things that might be disruptions, including labor conduct. And so how would the people not be paranoid about casting a ballot in a mailbox which Amazon had installed? So I don't know whether these lessons
That had its impact. I think that had its impact on the public. I think that the public shares that fear of Amazon as well, increasingly.
I know a lot of people who said, and who people have no connection to labor law or anything, have said, how can the employees not vote for a union in Amazon?
Right. I agree.
I guess those would be my last words. And again, I urge all of you to register and attend the LERA national meeting. It's June 5th to 8th. I think we have a lot of really good sessions, good speakers, and a lot of these issues will be touched upon. So I thank you all for the opportunity to be here tonight. Thanks, Tom, for having a conversation with me.
Thank you, Wilma. And it's going to be a great meeting, so everybody should register.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Good session. Bye-bye, Wilma. Bye, Tom.